Hello everyone, welcome along to the Double Top Podcast. It's episode number 2 and it's been quite some time since we've done the last episode. My name is Josh and I would usually say that I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host, Chris Welch. However, unfortunately, he's not here today. He's having a little break from YouTube, so fingers crossed we do have him come back again in the next coming weeks. I hope he is doing well if he's watching this. So it's just me on my own. But we've got lots of stuff to talk about today on the episode of this podcast, including a very, very special PDC guest that joined me for a very special interview. It is the one and only Devin Peterson, of course, the 31st ranked player in the PDC Order of Merit, who I did do an interview with earlier today, so that's going to be coming up a little bit later on the podcast. But we've also got a few other things to talk about. As you can see at the bottom, I'm going to be talking about the Ladbrokes Masters, which was a few weeks ago. We'll also be talking about the Premier League of Darts. We now know the official 10 men taking part in the competition. And we've also just today, as I'm recording this, we've had a few little bits of information that's come out regarding how the tournament and when the tournament is going to be taking place. And then we'll also be looking ahead to the PDC Super Series alongside the players that have picked up their tour card at Q School in the past couple of weeks. So there's a lot to talk about. Without further ado, I'd usually have a bit of a longer intro. We talk about how things are over the last week. But as I said, I haven't got Chris with me, so it makes it a little bit harder for me to kind of keep this as a longer podcast. So I'm just going to go straight into the first kind of topic, and that is all about the 2021 Ladbrokes Masters that we saw took place a few weeks ago in the PDC. I did also forget to say, usually we would tend to stream this podcast live on YouTube. Now, because we've had a few different things going on with the interview that was recording and stuff, we decided that this week's episode is going to be pre-recorded. But if you have any questions that you would like to ask myself or Chris, not just throughout today's episode, that's already been recorded, but over the next coming weeks regarding the likes of the PDC Super Series or the UK Open, then do put your comments in the bottom section of this video and we'll keep an eye out for them. So in our next episode, we've got a few extra talking points. As I said, fingers crossed, Chris will be back for that next episode. But even then, do put your comments and questions in, because it would always be nice to have your feedback and also your opinions on the world of darts. But we've got to start off with the tournament that took place a few weeks ago. It was the 2021 Ladbrokes Masters. And what a tournament it was. You know, we talked about it in the first episode, and it was one of those where a lot of players will go into that competition a little bit excited for it. And I think because we'd only had the World Championship a few weeks before it, we're in a very, very different scenario usually, because they'd have the 2 or 3 week breaks with the darts players. They would go away, have a bit of a break. And then they'd come back for the Ladbrokes Masters, kind of as the first competition of the year, where players would really restart themselves. But this year is very, very different. We haven't had that. You know, the whole COVID situation which has been going on has meant that a lot of these players have been stuck at home, more likely than not, practicing on the dartboard and getting themselves ready for this competition. And I have to say, it was an absolutely fantastic tournament. Really, really good. And I didn't really get to watch much of the Masters last year, purely because I was doing a few different things and I was away. So for me, this kind of was one of my first real Masters tournaments where I was able to sit down and watch it all and really take it in. And it was really, really good to watch. Now, first of all, we have to talk about the main point, which is Johnny Clayton going on to win the tournament. And he had a brilliant, brilliant performance. He came into the very first game. It was actually in round 1 where he faced off against Jose de Souza. And I think a lot of us at that point, you know, we looked at a game like that and we thought, realistically, Jose de Souza looked like the most likely candidate to go through in that game. But he did brilliantly, brilliantly well, the Welshman. 102.93 average, which Jose de Souza had 101.29. So he did incredibly, incredibly well in that game. And he did eventually go through 6-5. Really close match overall. And I do think, as I said, it was one of those games where a lot of people expected Jose to go through. But Johnny Clayton did very well in the end. But the game that came next was an absolutely unbelievable match. And probably one of the better games of the tournament. And that was Michael Van Gerwin against Johnny Clayton. Now, Van Gerwin, coming into this tournament off the back of a very disappointing run at the World Championship, the 5-0 whitewash still being quite relevant at that point against Dave Chisnell, meant that Van Gerwen was coming into this new tournament at the start of the fresh calendar year, hungry and ready to try and get some success. And actually what came was a very, very shocking performance in my opinion. The game did go to a last leg decider, eventually finishing 10-9 to Johnny Clayton. But MVG only averaged 96.56, which when you look at the averages of the second round, it's one of the lowest averages of that specific round of the tournament. The only ones that were lower at that point were Gary Anderson's 91.66, Nathan Aspinall only averaging 92, but it was enough for him to go through against Mensur Suljovic. And then Chris Dobie getting a 94.57 average. Apart from that, all the other averages pretty much in the rest of the second round were higher than MVG's. And he was struggling from time to time, finishing off his doubles, and he could never really get a point in the match where he could overtake Johnny Clayton. And you've got to give credit to the Welshman, because he did fantastically well just to keep up the pace with the Dutchman. And in the end, he went through on 10 legs to 9 and made his way through into the quarterfinals against James Wade. And I said this one, I said the Van Gerwen game was one of the games of the tournament. I think you have to put this Johnny Clayton-James Wade game as probably the match of the tournament. Both players averaging over 104, which is unbelievable. Johnny Clayton averaging 105.41. James Wade averaging 104.02. It was an absolutely stellar match, this one. And the most important thing coming out of this game was the unbelievable stat. I think it was around about, was it 91%, I think, in terms of Johnny Clayton's finishes on doubles, which is, I'm pretty sure, the best finish percentage that there's been recorded in a PDC match. And I think I came out of that game and I looked at the side of the bracket that Johnny Clayton was on, which he was in the bracket alongside Peter Wright. And I think there was a lot of people at this point starting to believe that Johnny Clayton could go on and maybe win this tournament. And he went into this game against Peter Wright and just continued on in the same vein. 104.09 average to Peter Wright's 99.95. And yet again, it was another match that did go to a last leg decider. And a lot of credit has to be given to Peter Wright for how he played, because once again, it was one of those games where neither of the two players were able to shrug each other off. But in the end, once again, I think Johnny Clayton's finishing was around about the 60 to 70% mark. He was ruthless towards the back end of this tournament. And ultimately, I think it is one of the key points that allowed Johnny Clayton to go on and eventually lift the title, which he did, of course, against Mervyn King, beating him 8-11 on legs. And it was one of those games where Clayton dominated for large spells of the match. I think he was 3 or 4 legs up at one point on Mervyn King. And it was more the expectation of the game finishing to Johnny Clayton rather than Mervyn King coming back into this match. And you do have to give credit to Mervyn King. He's been brilliant over the last couple of months, had a pretty decent run at the World Championship, did really well in the last Ladbrokes tournament, making the final again against Michael Gerwin and losing that game. But, a brilliant one for Mervyn King in the end. But Johnny Clayton, it was such a crucial match because both players came into that final without realising that their Premier League spot was going to be on the line, which we will, of course, talk about the 10 men in that competition a little bit later on in today's podcast. But 11-8 overall, it was a massive win for Johnny Clayton in the end. The first PDC major TV title that went to the Welshman's name. And I think we are going to start to finally see Johnny Clayton maybe put his side job, I think as a carpenter, on the back burner, and him now start to become a real true professional darts player. And you know what? I'm really glad he made the Premier League. And I don't know whether Chris will feel the same. As I said, we'll get to talk to Chris a little bit more in the next episode of the podcast. But I think Johnny Clayton is a very welcome addition to the Premier League. And with the way that he played in this Ladbrokes Masters, he absolutely deserves his spot in the Premier League this year. And I do think I have to give a bit more credit to one other player as well. Now, he didn't go on to win the tournament. He didn't even realistically go on to make the semi-finals. But in the previous episode, it was quite a big talking point that myself and Chris had. Was based around Adrian Lewis. Now, we know Adrian Lewis is slipping down the rankings, and that was a large part was because of the whole COVID situation and how he wasn't able to play at the BoyleSports Grand Slam, which was a massive, massive miss for him in the end, and caused him to drop down the rankings a little bit. But he had a fantastic, fantastic tournament, coming into the Ladbrokes Masters under a little bit of pressure to go out there. And let's not forget as well that originally he wouldn't have actually been in this tournament had we not seen the 16-player format extended to a 24-man format, which saw him just sneaking as the 24th ranked player in the world. But what he proved for me in this tournament is that Adrian Lewis is not done yet. And this Ladbrokes Masters might have just given Adrian Lewis a little bit more belief that he can push up the rankings this year and maybe even go on and fight. I'm not going to say he's going to maybe win something. You never know these days with players. Some players just turn it up like that and can, go and fight for titles and stuff. But I really do think that this will have given Adrian Lewis a massive confidence boost going into the UK Open in a few weeks' time, because he came into the first game against Michael Smith, which is the picture you can see on your screen. And I think a lot of people were thinking Michael Smith was going to go through in this game. Both players coming off the back of disappointing results in the World Championship. Michael Smith losing to Jason Lowe. Adrian Lewis, I think, lost to Danny Baggish in the end. So both players very, very disappointed. But even with a 96.95 average, it was it's the fourth lowest recorded average of the first round. In fact, no, it's not. It's the sixth lowest average, my apologies, of the first round. And he did really, really well to come out in a game where Michael Smith was just struggling, surprise, surprise, with his finishers. And then he went through to the game against Gary Anderson, where he beat Anderson 10-8 on legs. And it was just a ruthless performance from Adrian Lewis again. And I don't really want to say too much about Adrian Lewis because there is a long way to go in this season. And this year, for him specifically, it is going to be so, so crucial to get himself a little bit lower down in the rankings, get himself towards the top 16, maybe even lower down to the top 10, depending on how he performs. But I really do think that this could be a detrimental year for Adrian Lewis. And who knows, if he can keep up the form that he played in the Ladbrokes Masters at the Ricoh Arena, who knows where he's going to be by the end of the year. We'll have to find out, of course. But I had to give a shout out to Adrian Lewis there. I think a few disappointing players in the tournament. Glenn Durrant played really poor, although Mervyn King blitzed him 6-1 with a 100+ average. Dimitri van den Berg, I actually think, was one of the most disappointing players of this tournament. Lost 6-2 to Chris Dobie and did never really turn up in the first round. And I think, of course, he's had surgery quite recently, so hopefully, if he does watch this, which I'd be very surprised if he does, but hopefully the surgery went well for him in the end. But realistically, of course, you have to say Van Gerwen as well. Very, very disappointing run for him. And we're going to, of course, talk a little bit later on about some of those tournaments taking place in the next coming weeks. We've got the PDC Super Series starting in a few days' time when this video goes up, alongside the UK Open at the beginning of April time. So there's a lot of chances for these players to redeem themselves, but it is now that part of the season where there's a lot of big games to come. There's a lot of big tournaments. It is key that some of these players do start off on the right foot. It brings us on to our next point in the podcast. I'm still getting used to a little bit of not having my co-host Chris today, which means it probably will be a little bit of a shorter episode in terms of how long our last one was. But we've got to talk about the Premier League of Darts because we've now had confirmation today, as of the time that I've recorded this, that we are going to see certain games being played behind closed doors. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the podcast because we now know the 10 players that are going to be taking part. It was a massive, massive talking point of who the last player was going to be. There were big names being predicted, the likes of Stephen Bunting, Joe Cullen, Dirk van Dijvenbode have been up there. But as I said earlier, we found out at the end of the Ladbrokes Masters that the winner of that tournament was going to be the person who took the final space in the Premier League of Darts. And as we know, this is the lineup now. We know that Johnny Clayton was the man that took the final spot in the 2021 Premier League of Darts, which means we've got Johnny Clayton, Jose de Souza, Rob Cross, Glenn Durrant, Peter Wright, Gerwin Price, Van Gerwen, Gary Anderson, Nathan Aspinall, and Dimitri van den Berg as the 10 players that are going to be participating in the Premier League of Darts this year. And there are a lot of fans who were complaining and saying, why is somebody like Rob Cross for example, in the tournament. But of course, we've been ranked 4th in the world. He just has to be in there because he's ranked 4th still. You know, if he was a little bit lower down the rankings, then maybe probably wouldn't have got into the Premier League of Darts in the first place. But I said earlier on, when we talked about Johnny Clayton, I absolutely think he deserves his spot. You know, with the way that he played at the Ladbrokes Masters, we could see him do quite well in this competition. And for me this year, when I look at the kind of players in the 10-man pool, this could be a very, very open Premier League. Now, there'll be one specific player, as I said a moment ago, Rob Cross, who will be probably one of the more likely candidates where people predict him to finish bottom. But there are some brilliant, brilliant players in there. Of course, Glenn Durran, who has been struggling a little bit this year. He'll be hoping to try and retain his Unibet Premier League title. Michael van Gerwen, of course, he'll be looking and thinking this year, well, if I can get my Premier League title back, that'll be a massive confidence booster going into some of the tournaments later on this year. But I think there's a few underdogs in there. You know, Gary Anderson this year, I wouldn't really call him an underdog, but I would say, coming off the back of a few brilliant results over the last year, getting to the final of the World Match Play, the World Championship, of course. You know, Gary said over a lot of his interviews in the past that he's hungry for success. You know, he's been getting on the dartboard the last couple of weeks with Ryan Searle, practicing ahead of these big tournaments, and something feels like Gary Anderson might be back. And I'm not saying that Gary Anderson ever went away, but I think even Gary himself will probably think that he did have a little blip. But I think Gary will be up there at the end of the season. But there are a few of the players that I think will be up there. Dimitri van den Berg, who for me is not necessarily an outsider to win this tournament, but I think he could be one of the players that makes it to the semi-finals/finals later on in the year. And I do even think if Jose de Sousa can stop counting terribly and accidentally miscounting at points, I really do think we could see Jose de Sousa fight towards the top spots. I'm not saying he's going to get there. Personally, I think he will be one of those players maybe that gets around 5th, 4th. But there's some really, really good plays this year. And now we've lost the competitors format, which if you aren't aware, there'll be no challengers or competitors this year coming in. It is just a flat-out 10-man format. I think this is one of the toughest Premier League 10-player formats that we've had in terms of predicting who's going to finish where. Because the likes of Van Gerwen have struggled at times and other players, Rob Cross has struggled this year, it's going to be very, very hard to predict how this 10-man format finishes. But either way, 2 players will be relegated after Judgment Night, which I am going to talk about now because we did have confirmation today that the Premier League of Darts 2021 is going to be behind closed doors for now. And the big news that came out, of course, earlier on, I know it's something that people don't really want to talk about anymore, but the UK are looking in May to try and get fans back into stadiums, back into arenas for sporting events in the near future, which means I would assume that, as you can see on the screen now, the PDC must have had a slight inkling about what was to come with the announcement today, because what they have announced is that the first 9 nights of this tournament are going to be taking place behind closed doors. Now, you can see the first 5 nights between Monday, April the 5th and Friday, April the 9th. Those first 5 nights will be behind closed doors, which means we've got 5 solid days of Premier League action. So if you are a fan of the darts on our channel, do stick about because I will be doing watch-alongs for all of the nights in the Premier League. And then there will be a 10-day break. I'd assume, of course, that is around the Easter period as well. And then we'll have the final 4 nights up to Judgment Night between Monday, April the 19th and Thursday, April the 22nd. And then, of course, on Judgment Night, that is a big, big moment in the Premier League calendar because we will find out which 2 players are going to be relegated from the Premier League. And then after that, I would assume, with the way that it is sounding, and of course it all depends these days on the situation at hand with COVID and vaccines and stuff. That's a talk for another time at the very least. But depending on what happens, we could see fans back for the final other nights of the tournament alongside the semi-finals and finals, which will take place later this year. Of course, no time has been accredited yet, so we don't know when that is going to be. But hopefully, by that point, we might have fans back in the stadium again. But as for now, those first 9 nights, They're going to be behind closed doors at the Marshall Arena in Milton Keynes. But the positive news is, regardless of the fact whether it's behind closed doors or not, we've got 9 days of solid action to come in the Premier League of Darts, which, as I said, we'll be covering live on our YouTube channel. Do put your predictions in the chat. I'd love to hear what you guys think of the Premier League. Who's going to go down? Who's going to win the Premier League? Who's going to make the semi-finals and finals? Put your predictions in the comments below. And in the next episode, I'll pick out a few of your comments to put on the screen and we'll talk through your Premier League predictions. Now, as I said, today's episode is going to be a little bit shorter. Very hard to fill up the time without having Chris with me today. But I have got another piece of news to talk about before we go into our interview with Devon Peterson. So don't go anywhere because it's a brilliant, brilliant interview to come. And you guys will get to see it first on the podcast because I'm going to put the podcast up early alongside the interview on this episode. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the interview up in a separate video the day afterwards. So do stick around because we've got that sneak peek of the interview to come a little bit later on in the podcast today. But we've got to talk about Q School because that was one of the next big things that has taken place after the Ladbrokes Masters. And what a Q School it was. Very different conditions because of COVID and things like that. But we had some severe drama in terms of the 21 tour cards that were given out in the end over the UK and European Q School events. And as you can see on your screen, this was the Q School UK tour cards that were given out. Some very, very recognisable names in there. One of them, at the very bottom of the list, Danny Baggish. Now, Danny Baggish, we know him at the World Championship, had a fantastic run in the tournament, and honestly, God bless his soul, he had a very bad situation with his brother, as far as I'm aware, which really did kind of, I'd probably say, spur him on in the tournament. And fair play to him, a really enjoyable player to watch. And he got his tour card on the final day. He was sat at the bottom on 0 points and got himself an incredible run on the last day of Q School to get himself the 5 points and the sufficient amount of legs needed to get himself a tour card. So a massive, massive moment for Danny Baggish, who gets himself a tour card for the next 2 years. And I cannot wait to see him because I think he's a brilliant player. I've watched a lot of his interviews off screen. I know he did a video quite recently, I think, with Edgar, talking about darts. He's a brilliant, brilliant player and a really interesting person to talk to as well. And I'm very excited to see how he does in the tournament. And specifically, of course, across other PDC events because, of course, he's already got his Q School. He's completed Q School is what I was wanting to say. But some other recognisable players in there. I think a lot of people will remember Gordon Mathers. He's got his tour card as well. Good to see him back with a tour card. Been quite a while since we've seen him. Alan Sutar as well, another player too. I think there's a few other players. Kirk Shepherd automatically qualifying too, and Scott Mitchell. So there are a few recognisable players on that list. But also a few different players in there as well. Good to see Jack Main and Andrew Gliding get through. I think they're a lot of the players that people expected to go out there and get a tour card. And as you can see, in terms of the legs won and the points that they got, they did incredibly well to get themselves a tour card. But there's also the European side of the bracket. Now, it is very confusing, Q School. It's all based down on points and legs won and other things that go into it. So it's really, really confusing for the neutral. But as you can see with the European side of it, it was very, very dramatic. Lots of players going through and getting themselves a tour card. One of them being Martin Schindler, who hit a 9-darter against Raymond Van Barneveld, averaged 126 in one of the matches that he played. And I cannot wait to see him back in the PDC again because he looks revitalised as a player. You know, he was in the PDC events of the past, slightly dwindled down the rankings, which is a real shame for him. But it feels like maybe that Q School this year has revitalised his career on the Oki. So I'm looking forward to seeing how he does. Neil Zonneveld, another one of those players who has dropped down the rankings slightly. Got himself another tour card for the next 2 years, so I'm very excited to see how he does. But the one player on the list that everybody's been waiting to see, whether he get a tour card or not, of course, he's back, Raymond Van Barneveld. Now, you'll know we've talked to Chris in the past. Chris, I'm not going to say he's not the biggest fan of Raymond Van Barneveld. I think he was just more annoyed if Raymond got himself onto the Premier League. But he's back. And as much as people have complained in the past and said, well, he's one of those players that moans and things like that, I think there will be nothing better than going to a stadium in the near future, fingers crossed, touch wood, and hearing the eye of the tiger again. You know, a lot of fans, they will complain that he whinges and moans, but it will just be nice to have Raymond Van Barneveld back in the PDC. Now, whether he's going to be able to challenge the rest of the big boys or not is another question. And this first year for Raymond in these PDC events is going to be definitive, I think, for his mindset. Because we know in the past he has had a tendency to whinge and moan. And I think even, you know, he said in interviews himself that he has sometimes found himself whinging and moaning. And he wasn't in the right mind frame. But I do personally think that maybe Raymond Van Barneveld might surprise a few people and do very good this year. He's had plenty of time to practice. He's got himself a new mindset. And I want to see him do well. As a neutral of the darts, big fan of the likes of Raymond Van Barneveld, you want to see those types of players do well. And I'm looking forward to seeing how he does this year in the PDC. But then a couple of other players on the list as well. Galash, another one of those players from the past that people will recognise. But a few other players that missed out. I think one of them being Benito van der Pas, one of the recognisable players over the last couple of years. He didn't get a tour card, which is a massive, massive disappointment for Benito. One of those players over the last couple of years that I think people have expected to do quite well and has unfortunately kind of dropped off a little bit. So maybe we might see him next year come back to try and get a tour card. And then also we didn't get to see the likes of John Park come back to fight for a tour card because of COVID. They decided to step back and come back next year. So the 2022 Q School could be a fairly tricky Q School, considering the amount of players that have had to not participate because of quarantining and COVID and other kind of issues going on in the background. So that is all the talk about the Q School, tour cards and the confirmed players. Without further ado, I think there's only one thing that some of you guys have been waiting for, and that is the interview with Devin Peterson. And this is the moment that I've been waiting for quite a while. I had a massive opportunity a few days ago to interview Devon Peterson. Of course, as we all know him, Dancing Devon, the African Warrior. He's a brilliant person to talk to. And I had a massive opportunity to talk to him about his career in darts. I was able to talk to him about the future for Devon Peterson, the World Championship. There's a whole host of different subjects that we talked about. And I'm delighted to say, for you guys watching the Double Top podcast today, you are going to be able to see this interview first. What I'm going to do, as I said before, this interview you're going to be able to watch now, and then I'm going to put a separate video up of the whole interview, once again on a separate video. So if you do want to watch it back, it will be available very, very soon as a separate video on its own. But just before I put the interview on, I want to say a massive thank you once again to Dave Allen, the head of media at PDC. A massive thank you to Devon's agent and, of course, Devon himself for this fantastic opportunity, because we're only at episode 2 and we've already got an interview of this magnitude, so I'm very excited. But for you guys at home, do enjoy it. This is a fantastic interview I undertook not too long ago with Devon Peterson. It's brilliant. I'm delighted to say today I'm joined by the 31st ranked player in the PDC Order of Merit, and he is nicknamed the African Warrior. It is Devon Peterson. How are we today?
Josh, I'm great, my man, and I'm pleased to be interviewed by you today on your podcast. It's really great.
Thank you very much. First of all, once again, thank you very much for your time indeed. It's massively appreciated. I want to take you back to the very start of your career, and I know it's probably a question you've been asked a lot from many pundits and stuff, but what's the thing that got you into darts? And specifically, to kind of change the question up a little bit, who was the person in your life, whether it would be a darts player or somebody in your family, that gave you the motive or the drive to go out there and get your PDC tour card?
I think it was obviously our family, in a sense, as in my dad's side of the family. It's well kind of interviewed that my dad was the kind of driving force behind my career. I remember the one time I was doing South African for the like the international trials, and I got to a high level. I think I was ranked 3rd, and I never got selected for the team, and then came back and never practiced, never picked up a dart, and kind of lost the love for the game. And my dad said, why don't you just give it one more shot and just give it a proper shot, you know what I mean? And I think that words, I mean, those small, that little sentence kind of just resonated with me. And my dad's always been in my corner, no matter what I'm doing, always my biggest critic and biggest fan as well. So yeah, if you were to ask a dad, it's definitely my dad, and he in our family is a legend as well on the dartboard, and in our local community. So yeah, he was my first idol growing up in the sport, and definitely one of my biggest motivating factors to date.
And specifically as well, I know you had a period of time where you had quite a serious arm injury that kept you out of darts for quite a long time. When you came back again in 2015 and got your tour card, were there any players from the PDC that advised you to come back into darts again? Or were you thinking about maybe taking a little bit of a longer break?
No, I think the break that I took was kind of, it was almost destined in a sense, because at that time I just came over. I was trying to my behind off to kind of obviously maintain the tour card, get into the top 64, which I did. And then the injury happened. And when the injury happened, it gave me a lot of time to kind of look at my life. And at that time, I think I was 26, 27 years old, and thinking, is this what I wanted? And then when I went back home, my dad was obviously, he was the one to give me the biggest comfort hug and say, listen, don't worry about it. You achieved a lot in the sport, achieved more than any African to do so. So I think with me, obviously, coming back and having my family as not a fallback, but being welcomed by the way in which they welcomed me. Just kind of, I felt as though I was back home and kind of finding my feet again. And then I realized very quickly, like, I want to be a professional dart player so bad that, and the next, I think the second bite of the cherry was the biggest bite, and probably my most intriguing, if you must, because I pushed even harder because I knew what needed to be put in place for me to perform, and so on and so forth. So I think where the question moves towards is players on the one side, like there's nobody really that kind of said come back or whatever the case may be. It was more just my drive and me wanting to achieve, and almost like this was unfinished business, if you must call it that. And I'm happy that I made that choice at that time, and I'm glad that I'm continuing to kind of reap the rewards, if you must call it that.
Absolutely. And, when we look on now, 6 years since your return, it's reaped the rewards, as you said, winning the German Darts Championship, 8-3 against Johnny Clayton was a massive result. But looking at the World Championship as well, I was going to ask you one question specifically, and it's not about this year's World Championship, but have you ever been in a situation out of the darting situation where you've had some hotel antics with other players, different situations and scenarios that maybe we don't see as a neutral from an outsider's perspective?
No, not really. I think obviously you could. Most of the players itself, it's a massively respected kind of tight group of players. Like, I think I'm not going to say the 128 because not everybody gets along, but I know that the top, like the let's say top 64 players, kind of, because you kind of travel all the time together and you kind of build like a relationship with different players. So there's no real antics or anything like early morning wake up calls or stuff like that. That's silly stuff. Most of the time it's the utmost respect and just beat you at your ability. I mean, if you get beat, some players do tactics. We've seen that, and I've experienced my fair share, but more recently now than ever before. And I think that is because my level has increased and ability to dominate on the board. So now it becomes that it's the things that they need to do to kind of win or trying to put you off your game. But you learn all of these things. But I know that most of the players have the utmost respect for each other in competition and battle.
Absolutely, and it's fantastic to watch. And talking and coming back to the World Championship this year, I know it's kind of the one piece of the one topic that people don't want to talk about right now, COVID. It's very, very frustrating. But how is the atmosphere different for you? Because it's not just a case of fans not being there, but the practices in terms of going to the hotels and even just practicing in general. How different was it for you this year in comparison to the other World Championships of the yesteryear?
I think not even just the World Champs, but if you look at all the majors or everything since lockdown, and us and the PDC done a fantastic job of obviously hosting a remainder of the tour and majors, and you have to thank the sponsors for that as well. But if you look at, I was thinking about it like intensively as well, and just how I will prepare this season, because last season was kind of a shock to many of the players, and you'd see some players flourish, players that wouldn't, like people say, they wouldn't have won a tournament if there was a crowd, which I don't believe. but also just the psychological effect of remaining in a bubble, being tested, waiting for your results. All of these things kind of change and adapt the way in which you have to focus for the game, because you're waiting for results. You're hearing some players getting removed from tournaments, and that kind of sends it's a different vibration. You're always worried before you get to the tournament. Am I going to be free of COVID or test negative? There's just so many negatives about preparation and all of these things that kind of dampen the way in which you prepare for the game, or the way in which you perform, in a sense. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. A lot of players are strong enough to kind of get through that. But I think that me, in retrospect, looking at it, it was tough, because you get to the tournaments and you go, okay, cool, I need to test. And then once you test, you play your tournament, you go back home, you're coming back, and then you have to test again. So it's always a almost an unease, or nothing is just, okay, cool, I'm here to play darts, which is a dynamic that we needed to kind of not go against, but a dynamic we needed to adapt to. And I think that it was done professionally, and loads of the players performed really well, because I think a lot of the times the sport itself obviously leans itself to the entertainment and atmosphere, obviously contributing to performances. Some players struggled, obviously, because they never had that geeing up of the crowd and the sounds and all of that stuff. And some players couldn't handle the empty hall where there's no atmosphere, which is tough, because what I experienced in that point is that it's business as usual. So it's as if you're playing a pro tour, but on a bigger stage. I'm not going to say I enjoyed it, but I found out a lot about myself in those moments, and realized a lot more about how the game's going to develop, and what we need to look forward, and things you need to put in your practice, and things you need to kind of psychologically add to your game itself because of these things that we have. But I think that as professionals, I mean, you have to adapt or die, and I'd rather just adapt.
Absolutely. And talking about adapted, of course, you played really well at the, not the Ladbrokes World Grand Prix, it's the BoyleSports World Grand Prix, where you had a really tough group, the likes of Devon Peterson and stuff. How do you compose yourself? Was it very different in terms of when there's a crowd there? Do you compose yourself in a very different manner to there being no crowd? Because as you said, it's very tough for some players these days. I think one player which everybody tends to say does better with a crowd is Gerwin Price. Rallies up the crowd and that. For you, did you have to compose yourself differently, or was it kind of the same straight face even without a crowd?
No, I think it's a whole host of like the crowd's energy kind of can carry you through a game as well. It can bring you into games that you are out. A lot of the times, because you're in your own head, it's the loudest thing in playing darts is being in your own head, and sometimes a small distraction in a crowd can kind of take you out of your own head and just change the way in which you approach the game, might make it easier. The players like the likes of Nathan Aspinall, he likes the crowd as well. You mentioned Gerwin Price, Peter Wright as well. It's just that geeing up, and I think that those, especially for me, my best performance this season was at the Euros, and we had a crowd there as well, and there were South Africans there. So mentally, there's an energy that you can't, like an unspoken energy with the crowd there that changes your dynamic of thinking and performance, and just it's almost as if you like a gladiator in battle and there's a crowd there. So it changes the way in which you get this extra energy or extra power or just a dominating force that you feel that adds to your game. And I think that preparation is completely different to any times. But mentally, I think some players handle the composure better than others. And that's why we have so many different winners.
You've kind of taken me on to the next question that I was going to ask you. You spoke about one of your best games. What's one of the most hard-fought matches that you've played in? It doesn't necessarily have to be a game that you've lost or a game where you've found it really tough. But what's the hardest match where you've looked back and you thought to yourself, I never thought I could maybe go on and win this game, but I did in the end, or an incredible comeback?
I think it would have to be the Gerwin Price game in the Euro Championship when I won.
Yeah.
I came back from 5-1 down, but at that point in time, I never felt like I was out of the game because I was missing shots. And at that time, he was just taking the shots out, which obviously the quality of the player himself. But I always just felt like I was in there, and I just almost felt like I just need to tidy up a lot of like the throws itself and not lose focus of what I'm here to achieve. And I clicked on when it was 5-1, and yeah, I think that turnaround for me kind of gave me, and that obviously spurred me on to win it that weekend, because the self-belief and confidence was out of this world, but also just the composure and just competing at that level and knowing that my intensity can remain at that level for a long time. So yeah, it's definitely the Gerwin prize game, and obviously now world number one, world champ, and performed brilliantly this season and like other seasons as well. But this season obviously was the standout because he lifted the trophy. But yeah, I think the Gerwin prize, and just I think it's also the kind of player that he is. He's a very aggressive, very dominating, kind of confident player, and I'm exactly the same. But he's just more vocal about it, in a sense, like vocalizes his celebrations and so on. But I think that because it was against him as well, it's those things can kind of deter you or distract you from potentially being the best that you could be on a game. But because it was against him, I knew that my preparation was slightly different, and I was ready for the game. And luckily for me, I came through victorious. And like they say, the rest is history.
Has there ever been times where you've played someone like Gerwin Price where, because as you said, they're quite animated and enigmatic, has there been times where you've been part of that and you've been roaring yourself and kind of, I'm trying to think of the word to put it in the best way, the atmosphere of the game has kind of taken over a little bit too much? Has there been times like that?
Yeah, I think myself against MVG was one of those games where I got lost in translation with regards to him celebrating silly scores, opening checkouts, and just celebrating lucky shots that I say lucky because I missed it and he took it out. So in my head, he was lucky. He shouldn't have got the shot. But I obviously the game is about missing. But I remember saying that he was lucky, and I think mentally I shouldn't have approached it in that way. And these are the things that you learn, though, as a professional, a progressing professional, is the continuation of learning about experience through experiences in the game itself, and just having a retrospect, and maybe that atmosphere in the game. Not that I won't get involved, but I think that I won't lose myself that much. In that game, I lost myself a lot, but I think I performed okay. It's just the finishing in that game. But I think, like you say, the distraction was that animated, which I'm really not. I'm not that animated, but I can get animated if I wanted to. But yeah, I think that is the game, a highlighted game for me in last season's regarding the animation and getting involved in another player.
It's brilliant to watch. And something else that you've been doing on the side is punditry, of course, for Sky Sports. You're one of the only players in the UK specifically who tend to take on a punditry role alongside playing the sport. One thing I'm very interested in asking you is, when you're not playing and you are doing a little bit of commentary or punditry work, has there ever been times in tournaments where you've watched players and you've actually seen something where you can improve upon in your own game?
That is ultimately I think one of the reasons or contributing factors to my success last season is that I saw the game from a third eye, if you must call it that. So not just a player or a pundit, but from an analytical point, and seeing players make mistakes or learn from players' mistakes very closely. Like if you're watching games sitting on a couch, it's different from when you're commentating and analyzing a game that's happening, unraveling in front of you, which gave me a complete different look. And I think that my interest in having experienced pundits and commentators like the likes of Wayne Mardle, Rod Studd, Stuart Pike, you got Nigel and Mark Webster as well. I mean, Mark has been a previous world champ as well, and just listening to him and kind of taking on his information that he's also sharing whilst doing it, it's a very involved role, and I think that as a sports, like my preparation last season was great because of that punditry role. And I think that I've carried it in this season and I've added to it. So yeah, hopefully this season continues like I did last season, or even better it. And I think that a lot of players in the sport itself, we don't, like before I'd done the punditry role, we don't look at the game that analytically, in a sense, like what the players' weaknesses are, we just go on based on our opinion of a player and just how our game is, because we a lot of the top players feel like if we play our A game, then we will beat anybody. But ultimately, it's not the case. You're not going to always play your A game. But you also need to be aware of the other player's weaknesses. And when he shows it, that's the time. And I think Phil Taylor done that to a T. Like, smell blood when the blood is in the water, and then he'll just devour you. And I think that's kind of just, I'm sharpening my teeth on that and realizing that it's part of the game now.
Absolutely. And you said earlier about, of course, Wayne Mardle, one of the fellow pundits. We know in the past you've worked with Wayne Mardle quite a bit to improve your game. How's Wayne Mardle helped over time? Because I'm guessing a lot of lockdown you'll have spent time working with him to improve your game, because you've massively boosted up the rankings. I think you've gone from 59th in January 2020 all the way up to 31st in the world. How's Wayne Mardle helped to improve your game overall?
I think, I mean, obviously it's documented that I speak about the technical aspect of the game and how he's kind of cut the fat off my throw, and just we kind of go into the bare bones and knowing and mapping it out completely. And that's obviously a lot of work from my side and a lot of input and experience from his side. So yeah, I think Wayne's involvement in the new Devon Peterson, or the African Warrior, the resurrection of his career, of my career as well. I mean, Wayne has been instrumental, and the likes of Colin Lloyd as well from a mental perspective. Wayne does also add to that mental perspective.
Yeah.
And then I had chatting to Phil Taylor as well, and it's not me name dropping, but at that point in time of my career, I kind of just tried to get the best resources that I possibly could get, like getting information from the best player to ever throw a dart. That's phenomenal. And then you got the likes of Colin Lloyd, one of the most aggressive players, but also a winner. And then Wayne Mardle, obviously technical expert. So I had like the three wise men, if you must call it that, in my corner. And I kind of found like there's loads of information that I grasped, and some of the information went right over my head, which I kind of re-looked at this year and in retrospect now, hoping that I can put it into my game this season. But everything, it just came on all at once. So I needed to kind of filter a lot of the stuff and slowly progressing. But I'm looking forward to the season and obviously calling on their expertise again.
Absolutely. This season, of course, is coming thick and fast. And of course, we've had quite a bit of a break between the last tournament, which was the World Championship, the tournaments coming up ahead, the UK Open and the PDC Super Series. How have you improved your game over the last few weeks? Have you been trying out new darts? Has there been new tactics? Of course, you don't want to give too much away, but has there been anything you've been improving upon?
Yeah, everything, literally everything. So from I looked at the way in which I wanted my dart to lay in the board. So that meant that there's an upgrade on my dart. The flighting system, there's an upgrade. Physical appearance and kind of health and fitness, there's an upgrade on that. I've got new shirts that's slightly a change in cut, which physically people will say, yeah, that's crazy. But I think just a change in fit in your shirts might just adapt better in throwing as well. So all of these things I needed to look at as well. And then also I obviously follow the stat side of the game quite in depth. And I use the darts article on Twitter all the time as my go-to for stats, because this season, I mean, last season, I looked at the areas that I needed to focus on. The back end of the season was all about finishing. The scoring was great. First darts was great. The swaying of the different areas. And I mapped out a kind of strategy for myself using these tools available and looking at upgrading the performance, because I know a lot of people, the comments, not that I pay attention to it, but I see it. And a lot of people's opinion is that he's playing the darts of his life. But for me, it's just more about a new standard. And I think that for me to improve, I needed to encompass all of these attributes, which is the stat side and looking at the areas that I actually perform well in and enhance that, and the areas that I don't perform well in, how do I better that? And yeah, I've worked on so many things over the last 2 months. I had 5 days off after the Worlds, and then came back strong. And yeah, I think this season I'm thinking positively, and hopefully I continue the rise up the rankings, and fingers crossed in 2022 it could be me as your world champ, which I always say, because it's the one goal that I'm striving for.
And you've come on perfectly to the question I was going to ask you. I was going to say, of course, at the end of this year, Where does Devon Peterson want to finish? What's the aims? Are there any major tournaments you want to win? Is it a case of, as you said before, rising up in the rankings and maybe seeing if you could squeeze into the Premier League next year? What's the aim for Devon Peterson when you look back at this next year?
I think if you talk about Premier League for me is ultimately is more of a cherry on a cake, and instead of not the cake itself.
Yeah.
The cake for me is ultimately being the world champ, and with that comes with a loads of competent progression, if you must call it that, and playing ability, and constant playing ability, playing at a high level. So my immediate goals are just rising up the ranks, as in progressively as I possibly can with every tournament, and then also hopefully getting into the top 16 by the end of the season, with hopefully winning one major or two, or just lifting up the World Champs trophy. I mean, that for me is not just a win for Devon Peterson, but a win for the continent, and I think that changes the sport in Africa, which the ripple effect is massive, and I think that Africa needs a world champ, and I'd put everything into it to obviously achieve that. So yeah, I think laying it out like short, medium, and long-term goals is always about it. And at the end of it all, the world champs is at the end of the season. So we just at the start of the season now, which is upon us, and I feel ready. My game is polished up. I think I still have a few like 72 hours before actually game day. So yeah, I think there's still a bit more polishing to do, and hopefully I can achieve all the goals I set out this season.
Absolutely. Who knows? Might be lifting that World Championship by the end of the year. And then the last question I've got for you. You're well known for being Dancing Devon. You've got your brilliant walk-on song, Waka Waka. But if the PDC came out today and said you couldn't use that song anymore, what song or other songs would you have in mind to have as your walk-on song?
Wow. I think the Waka Waka is obviously testament, not just because it's a jivey kind of moving song, but also the testament to the words itself. I mean, it's all about standing up, dusting yourself off, going back into battle, and kind of, it resonates exactly with me and my career. So the Waka Waka, like you said, fits perfectly. But yeah, I'd probably go with what's that song? I'm sexy and I know it, you know.
Oh, I know which one you mean. I can't remember the name of it exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it just plays upon my character, and not that I think that I'm God's gift, but yeah, I think that it definitely will get the crowd bouncing, and also the bass line is great in that. But there's loads of great songs out there, and I think that some players have the songs that fit their character, and that would be probably just mine.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic choice. And once again, Devon, massive thank you for the time taken out to give us this interview today. It's massively appreciated.
Cheers, Josh. I appreciate it, my man, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much. So there you go. That was the interview that I was able to undertake with Devon Peterson not too long ago. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful insight into the life of a PDC player in darts. And it's interesting, as Devon said, you know, some of the stuff that we don't get to hear as a neutral from the outside world, the COVID testing and the daily routines of a darts player. I think it was a lovely interview, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Fingers crossed if it wasn't a bad interview for Devon. I'm hoping in the future we can maybe get more interviews with other darts players and people within the PDC and maybe even the BDO in the future. So if there's anybody you would like to maybe see have an interview on this channel, do put a comment in the section below. Obviously, I can't guarantee we're ever going to get an interview. It's quite hard enough to be able to get interviews sorted. But hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get some more guests on in the future. And once again, a massive, massive thank you to Devon, his agent, and Dave Allen for allowing me that fantastic opportunity to interview Dancing Devon. And we wish him the very best of luck in his future tournaments in the PDC. I will also be uploading that interview as a completely separate video on its own. It shouldn't actually be too long after the Double Top podcast episode has gone up. So you guys that have been watching this, you've been given the first kind of look at the interview with Devon Peterson. But I'm going to be uploading that at some point, hopefully a few hours or maybe a day or so after the Double Top podcast. So if you do want to watch that interview on its own again, then do, of course, check it out on the YouTube channel very, very shortly. Because, as we said, you know, it is a brilliant, brilliant interview. Well worth watching again if you're a massive fan of Devon Peterson. So that is it for a probably slightly shorter edition of the Double Top podcast this week. And I hope that if you guys have enjoyed it, you don't forget to leave a like and a subscription on the channel, because it's not always me babbling on for 35-40 minutes on my own. I am hoping Chris will be back with us in the next episode of the podcast. Of course, as I said, he is taking a break from YouTube, so I hope he is doing good in the meantime. But don't forget, if you haven't liked or subscribed already, please do. As I said before, we've got more darting content to come in the near future, including more episodes of the Double Top podcast, which we'll be recording a little bit closer to the time when the Ladbrokes UK Open takes place, alongside some watch-alongs. If you don't know, we do darts watch-alongs on this channel. So we'll be doing a couple of them for the Ladbrokes UK Open at the beginning of March, and we'll also be doing a lot of watch-alongs for the Premier League of Darts, which will be taking place around about April time. Of course, you saw the screen earlier on with the dates. So do stick around on the channel, because we've got a brilliant set of darts fans, and it's well worth checking it out. It's a really nice community, and hopefully you can watch me, no doubt, sit and drink alcohol on stream and shout 180. It's good fun. If you haven't checked out our social media links already as well, please do. Our Twitter and our Instagram, they're on the screen right now. Our Twitter is @the_top corner, and our Instagram is _sports corner _. Do check those social media links out, because I do post out on both of those pages when we are going live on YouTube, alongside our articles, which are available on our website, which is the sports-corner.com. We launched our website a few weeks ago. We put articles up on the website pretty much every single day. In fact, today I put up a piece based on the Premier League of Darts, and we've also had a piece based on Chelsea. So do check them out already if you haven't. That is the sports-corner.com. I will be uploading the interview with Devin Peterson on the website as well, so please do check that out. If you haven't already, I said it's the sports-corner.com. And for those of you that are regulars on the channel and you're wondering what is coming up over the next few days, we've got a lot of sporting content to come. That's right, the Champions League is back on Tuesday. You can join Kieran D and Will live from 10 to 8 for Atletico Madrid Chelsea and Lazio taking on Bayern. And then on Wednesday, you can join myself and Kieran L for a live watch-along of the Champions League games between Atalanta Real Madrid and Gladbach Manchester City. On Thursday, we've got the Europa League live goal show from 5:55, covering those fixtures that we covered last Thursday, including the likes of Arsenal, Benfica. And then we'll also have a few of the boys sticking around. We've got United Real Sociedad and Leicester Slavia Prague as the two main games that we'll be covering. Of course, we will be covering a few of those other games in the background as well. So it should be a brilliant night of action on Thursday. And a brilliant week of action if you're a big football fan. But as for now, once again, if you have enjoyed the Double Top podcast, don't forget to leave a like and a subscription, and put your comments down below, because any of your comments we will be highlighting in the next episode of the podcast. But as for now, stay safe in these challenging times. We hope you have a fantastic morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are. And we hope to see you again soon on the Double Top podcast. Good night.